everyone, nice to see you again. Welcome to our Monday lecture. Before we start, I have a few announcements to make. So there is a talk on next Wednesday, actually next week on Wednesday, February 8th, by Dr. Philip Fope, and he will give. He's actually from the U.S., from Gustavus Adolphus College, and he will give a talk about political advertising in the U.S. presidential election, and that's going to take place in Pathwood, room C1, C2, so everyone who's interested, you're welcome to attend this lecture. It's open to all, you don't have to register or anything, just come by. And so what he'll do, he'll talk about the US presidential elections, obviously, and he will introduce you a little bit to political advertisements, so either candidate-sponsored or independently sponsored political advertisements. And he will embed that a little bit into strategies for electoral campaigns, discuss that, and also in general, I think he'll talk about political advertising in election campaigns. I think it'll be quite interesting. He is a professor in the US in political communication and rhetorics and so on. So he's working at the intersection of politics and media studies, and communication studies. So it's really interesting. I think it'll be an interesting talk. So if you are interested, just feel free to attend. Then the next announcement I have to make is again a reminder about our class test. And just one clarification. So all students have to write the class test. So you all have to be here on the 13th of February, so Monday in 2 weeks basically. If you cannot come, if you're sick, for example, if you're ill, I would need medical proofs to not give you 0% for the class test. And I've also received an email if there are other university things that you definitely have to attend. I would need proof for that as well. So please try to be here. And the ERUA class test is only for students who have an ERUA and not for students who basically cannot come because you have to be here. So students with an ERUA, I had this incident last year where someone would have rather written the class test because in this case the person thought, it takes less time. So if you want to write the class test, you're free to write the class test as well. But please send me an email by tonight if you are an ERUA student and would rather write the class test instead of the take-home class test. Okay, any questions about the class test? Okay, great, perfect. Then let's move over to today's program, just a short recap of last lecture on conservatism, and then we will also criticize conservatism a little bit. So what are the critical perspectives to look at conservatism? And then we will move over to talk about fascism as a political ideology. That's our program for today. Okay, so just very briefly, conservatism, last week, remember, we said one of the basic principles of conservatism is actually thinking in terms of hierarchies and always departing from a right to property. The right to property. And who owns property? These are usually political classes who are better off than other political classes. So it's all kind of circles around the right to property and leads to a hierarchical organization of society. And of course, those who own property are the ones who then in the end would rule the state, and they, of course, they don't want any change because they don't want to, first of all, lose their better position in society and their property and the ability to govern the country and to make the decisions. the underlying view of human nature is very pessimistic. So conservatives actually think that human beings are weak, they're selfish, and that's why they actually need someone who's very intelligent who can govern them. So this usually leads to a strong government, to an elite government, and also to valuing tradition, because if you always look back to the traditions, this leads to, stability and tranquility within a society. So view of human nature, we already mentioned that human beings are weak, selfish and irrational. We also said human beings are creatures of habit, so they always revert back to experiences, to tradition, and this human weakness actually also gives rise to conflict. So the political implications, basically, we've already mentioned that, is a conservation of political and social hierarchy and inequality, and this leads, to an elite government and a strong government, and in this way, it's very, we have to see that very much in contrast to liberalism. It's very much opposing. The underlying view of human nature is very much opposed to what liberals would suggest, and the political implications as well. So this, just very briefly, a repetition of last Wednesday's lecture. And now I want to move over to some critical thoughts about conservatism. So if you think about conservatism and the emphasis that is placed on tradition, one could also argue, if you look at it from a more critical perspective, you could also argue that any tradition is itself is actually built out of a series of historical change and reforms. I mean, a tradition wasn't just there, A tradition also had to become a tradition. So there's actually no reason why each new innovation or even a revolution should not later be also seen as part of a tradition. So after all, we can also speak of revolutionary traditions. So this is actually how France, for example, would portray itself. France often said to have a revolutionary tradition. So in their revolution is actually part of their political tradition. So this means tradition and revolution does not always have to contradict itself. In an attempt to defend policy of no change, what conservatives very much do, conservatives also exaggerate actually the extent to which our political practices are long-standing and unchanged, because at one point they had to come into being first, right? So they're not always tradition, they haven't always been there forever. At some point they must have been initiated. And then, conservatives argue that human beings are essentially weak and irrational and not able to govern themselves. But that some people are naturally superior and that this elite should govern. And this argument is actually in favor of some, we said that already, of some natural inequality, and this is very much rejected by liberals. So for liberals, for example, regardless of the inequalities that you find in wealth or in talent or in status, everyone is equal and all citizens have equal legal and political rights. So how can conservatives still defend this controversial claim that there is a natural elite? Very often they argue that this is because of education and upbringing, that some people are best suited to govern. But we could say, if we're really critical, we could say this is not a strong argument at all, because all we would have to do is to ensure that everyone has, equal access to education, for example, and and in this way, everyone would be equal in education and upbringing. So in this way, some of the conservative arguments are also really weak. some practices that have existed in the past are also not fair and should maybe not be preserved or conserved or perpetuated. So who actually decides what we still need and what has to be preserved and maybe what has to change? And the conservatives' emphasis on a government by elites implies that people who happen to benefit most from the present tradition also decide what is to be preserved. And this is something we also need to look at from a very, very critical point of view, right? So it's usually the governing elite who would decide what has to be preserved and what has to be changed. So this is something we need to criticize definitely when we think about conservatism. So, any questions about conservative critical points? Okay, then next point for today, main point for today also, are totalitarian ideologies. Totalitarian ideologies, and fascism, of course, is part of these totalitarian and has to be understood as part of these totalitarian ideologies. There are several totalitarian ideologies, and I think the most well-known examples are actually fascism and communism. So the essentialist definition of totalitarianism can be summarized as total methods in pursuit of a total goal. So this means putting the state above individuals, but not always for the same reasons. The difference in reasons can be seen in the difference between fascism and communism, which are basically the two classic forms of totalitarianism in the first half of the 20th century. So fascism is part of totalitarian thinking. Let me first outline what totalitarian thinking is at all. So totalitarian thinking often comes with certain characteristics, such as a utopian vision, a rather pessimistic view of human nature, making a distinction between real needs and felt needs, the sacrifice of freedom, strong politicization, and the supremacy of the state. And we will go through all of these 6 points now. So let's start with a utopian vision. The dominant ideology offers a utopian vision of an ideal society, a goal to which everything must be subordinated, even if it can never be achieved. So on the basis of this unique political truth, all rival ideologies are outlawed. There's no acceptance of a plurality of truth and no tolerance. There's just this one ideology, such as fascism, for example. Thinking in terms of institutions, the utopian way of thinking leads to one-party states and one-candidate elections. So if there's only one utopian idea, which might never be achieved, there's not much room for, let's say, plurality in a society, right? And this is what we mean by totalitarian thinking. There's one utopian vision, one dominant ideology, but there's no tolerance for any other ideas or any other political parties or any other political candidates. Then the second point is there's pessimism about human nature. So human beings are seen as innately wicked, selfish and antisocial. They are childlike, unable and incapable of leading autonomous lives and making their own decisions. They are in need of security and can only exist as part of the social entity. Because people are irrational and irresponsible, their salvation lies in their leaders. So, I mean, a bit similar to conservatism, actually, which, departs from the assumptions that human beings are weak and selfish. Here again, if if the view of human nature is very pessimistic, that usually requires a very strong government and a very strong leader. This, of course, leads to an understanding that elitism is necessary. And in general, this view of human nature is self-evidently opposed to any democratic aspirations and very much opposed to liberalism. The third point, there is a distinction between felt needs and real needs. So real needs, totalitarian ideologies make this distinction, and they argue that their defects make them incapable of knowing their own good. So people are not capable of knowing their own good. The despot or the ruling party enact the real needs of the people, often against their will and even coercively. If we think about it, it might be true that people do not think deeply enough or with enough foresight, but if we disregard their felt needs or preferences, there's no guarantee that the rulers will not substitute their own selfish interests for those of the people, which is exactly what totalitarian leaders are reputed to do. And here lies the danger in totalitarian thought. Power holders might pursue their private interests when unrestrained by a free democratic system, although they may try to disguise these as the real interests of the people or as the state's interests, falsely equating the state and the people. So this is the danger, right? There is a distinction between real and felt needs, and totalitarian leaders would always argue that they know what the real needs are, and that people might, think of something else as their felt needs, but they know what the real needs are, and they would do everything to actually realize or to realize political what is needed to meet these real needs. And this also means that if only they know what the real needs are, they can actually act against the will of the people, and they can pursue their private interests. This means this exclusive vision of truth, plus the notion of real needs, explicates and justifies the arbitrary and repressive nature of totalitarian rule. And the next point is sacrifice of freedom. So totalitarian states reduce the degree of personal and political freedom, sometimes offering greater material security instead. This is something, if you think about communism, for example, which is very true, right? So there was lots of economic material security in communism, but there was very little personal and political freedom. Freedom cannot be given priority as a political ideal, and often in totalitarian regimes, citizens have little political freedom but a fair degree of economic security. True actually in both communism and fascism. Now let's look at the next point, strong politicization. In totalitarian thinking or totalitarianism politicizes the whole of life, extending the public sphere and invading privacy in a way injurious to individual well-being. In Nazi Germany, for instance, even family life was politicized, with children in the Hitler Youth movement, if you remember that, often spying and informing on their parents, and that already started in school. So in school you became part of a youth movement in which you already, as a very young human being, had a political purpose. And to serve this political purpose, you would actually give out information about your friends, about your own family, about your classroom, and so on. So there is not really a private sphere. Everything is politicized. So this is a completely different understanding of the private and the public sphere that we saw in liberalism, right? With a great reduction of the private sphere. So the state actually tries to politicize everything and to leave very little private sphere in the end. And the last point is state supremacy. So in totalitarian thinking, the individual is always perceived as a subordinate part of the greater whole, meaning the state. So individuals are often treated as if they were uniform with identical needs and wants. And the survival of the state at all costs and by all means becomes the dominant political goal. So in Nazi Germany, for instance, the state was viewed as a mystical entity whose existence was bound up with the purity of the race and the territorial integrity of the nation. But in all totalitarian thought, statism is what most people would identify as the defining characteristic. However, we must always question the good faith of totalitarian states in practice. So very often elites in these states live a very good life, whereas the population suffers deprivation and repression. So the state is always put front, but if you actually, and there is this rhetoric that every individual is subordinate, which would in the end mean that the political leader should also be subordinate and the state as an entity is most important. But if you look into the political practice of fascist regimes or even communist regimes, because these totalitarian ideologies, I mean, just their basic characteristics are also true for other totalitarian ideologies like communism. In practice, you will often find a discrepancy between people who belong to the government and, you know, the normal people who often live a life which is which is is much poorer than the elite government's life is. Okay, so these in general are the characteristics of totalitarian ideologies, and now we move one step further to look at fascism in particular. So fascism is closely related to totalitarianism in most people's minds and is clearly an ideology which favors totalitarian methods of government. So fascism can actually best be understood within the context of time. For Hitler in German fascism, for instance, liberalism represented weakness which had paralyzed the Weimar Republic in the 1920s after humiliating defeat in the First World War. So the liberal societies of both Italy and Germany actually suffered the economic and psychological defeat in the First World War. So fascism was to be the so-called third way between communism and almost equally hated liberalism. It was aimed at the destruction of most of the liberties and norms of liberal society. In this sense, it was a truly radical movement. Fascist theory is actually scarce, and as a theory, it's absolutely inadequate. And many of the books that have been written since 1945 rather concentrate on the historical causes of the fascist phenomenon rather than analyzing the ideology, because there's really little in which, you know, there's really little logical scrutiny in here. And you will see that if we look at the main components, the main ingredients, so to speak, of fascism. So the first is its racialist basis. It was really racialist, thinking of a natural inequality. The second is there's a correct characteristic which we call ultranationalism. So nationalism to its extreme. And the third is state authoritarianism. And I will walk you through all of these three again. So let's start with the racialist basis. So the best known aspect of fascism is its racialist basis. The underlying premise is that of natural inequality and fascists hold that this exists between races as well as between individuals. So this is here, you can see, you can actually contrast conservatism and fascism. So conservatism, this is more about classes, right? And here in fascism, it's actually about a race. So one race is superior to the other, a quite dangerous thought. So the myth of race and that of Aryan supremacy was founded on various pseudo-scientific doctrines of the 19th century. So a confused blend of these doctrines was used to justify first imperialism, then the colonization of inferior races by several European countries, and then anti-Semitism, people and nation, blood and race, with its corollary of racial and sexual purity, became the key components of the Nazi myth. So a multitude of quasi-scientific theories percolated into fascism, especially those based on early anthropology, which dwelt on a difference between peoples and emphasized the inferiority of particular groups in terms of intelligence, moral character, and cultural practices. So you've all probably heard of social Darwinism already. Social Darwinism played an important part in fascism, both in justifying the natural selection and triumph of some races at the expense of others, and in vindicating the elite political leadership which characterized fascist states, the strong ruling of the weak. Needless to say, the doctrine of the survival of the fittest is directly opposed to humanitarian ethics and to welfare policies directed at disadvantaged members of society. In Germany, fascist propaganda claimed that Jews were undermining the state because their true loyalties were to the Zionist ideal, not to Germany. Also, most importantly, they were one of the inferior race which must not be allowed to interfere with Aryan purity. So the real-life consequences of these pseudo-scientific and political ideas were devastating in the end. Not only were 6 million Jews slaughtered, but also large numbers of other so-called inferior races, Slavs and Roma, for example, were sent to the gas chambers, as were many people regarded as being mentally ill or as homosexual, and so on. So very dangerous, this racialist basis. Let's move to the second point, ultranationalism. The second element of fascist belief is ultranationalism. So racism and nationalism is actually closely allied. The nation composed of the superior race is destined to triumph over other nations and peoples. This benefits the nationalist state, but may not actually be beneficial to the citizens because it potentially undermines family and property aspects relevant to liberal thinking. So just as the nation is set above the individual, the state as the executive embodiment of the nation must take priority over individuals and their personal needs and concerns. So ultra-nationalism in Nazi Germany led to a drive for territorial expansion and expansionist foreign policies. Hitler's demand that the German-speaking minorities in neighboring countries become incorporated into a so-called Greater Germany ultimately provoked the Second World War. And let's look at the third point, that state authoritarianism. A third important aspect of fascist ideology is state authoritarianism. Fascists advocate elite authoritarian government while invoking the support of the masses to validate their dictatorship by popular claims. So fascists view society as a totality, an organic unity, and this view, conjoined with a belief in elitism, is liable to produce authoritarian politics and a totalitarian state. So these are the main components, having a racial basis, thinking of ultranationalism. And ultranationalism does not only mean you refer to your own nation, but you try to extend you try to extend your own nation, and the state is above everything else, and everything you do should serve the purpose of the state, and that's why you don't really differentiate between a public and a private sphere, but rather try to politicize the entire life. So quite dangerous thinking. And what we'll do now is we will take a bit of an interactive break again. And I want you to just, turn around and look at the people who are sitting next to you, behind you, and get together in small groups, let's say of 3-4 students, just for, let's say, 5 minutes. And think about this. What, from your perspectives, are the main causes of fascism? We mentioned a few, but maybe you can even come up with more just from your own experience, from reading the paper, from reflection from other courses. So don't walk away far, but just look at the people who are around you. The 3-4 groups of 3, 4, and 5 would be fine, I think. And let's take 4 or 5 minutes to think about the causes of fascism. much. I saw most of you talking. I hope you actually did talk about fascism. And now I just want to hear some thoughts. And I decided I want to hear some thoughts from back there, from this part of the lecture theater, from this part of the lecture theater, from this part, and from this part. Okay, so who's going to start? Yes, please.
People like feeling lost, like they don't have a purpose, so then when someone comes in and gives them a reason to have a purpose, they can follow that.
Yeah, so people are feeling lost, and then someone comes in with a very strong ideology, right? And at least is giving them a purpose, or is, leading their path. Okay, thank you. Right. Anything else you discussed?
Blaming somebody, like, it was like, what's the Jews' fault, what's the communists' fault, and then piping up hysteria and propaganda and things. They say blame them, it's their fault.
Yeah. So very much opposing maybe other ideologies that were out there, like communism, and then it leads to a propaganda, process, and and to really say, this is actually what we not want, and to go into, let's say, the complete opposite direction. Yes, it was very much evolving out of criticism, or due to criticism to communism. That's right. Thank you. Up there, someone? Yes.
Yeah, I was also saying it's clearly empires or monarchies, particularly with Mussolini was probably stabilized with the Roman Empire. So we can get the head again, but also fascists and completely other elements like machine nationalism. And the difference between combining an identity with the nationalism, like whether it be racial in Mussolini and Hitler's fascism, or more religion, like in Franco in Spain. And the village can start as a new ideology, kind of principles at the time.
So, like, if you have a very strong feeling about your nation, let's say, or your race, and you identify with it, it's identity politics, right? So, very good.
Religion, in the case of Franco Spain.
Religion, yeah. Yeah. And this group.
For economic gain, because if you're ultra-nationalists and you're taking over your country to gain their mining sort of pleasure.
Yes, very important, actually. Also that if you think about Nazi Germany, for example, or even communism, it was always related to economic security. There was always the promise of economic security to the people. And then if you think of expanding the country, like you said, people had the hope to gain economically as well. So thank you very much. You mentioned really, really important causes, but what we could see is that fascism actually really developed in the context of a particular time where people actually opposed liberalism, opposed communism. Well, they were looking for economic security because that was not always there, and they very strongly identified, with their nation, with their race, and so on. But of course, we have to be very careful, because what has happened, of course, in, for example, Nazi Germany, was a catastrophe, of course. And I also brought you some quotes by Mussolini and Hitler that I want to discuss with you, but also read this with caution, of course. So. This is from Mussolini and Gentile, what they wrote about the doctrine of fascism. And if you're actually interested in reading some primary sources on fascism, there's this Festenstein and Kenny book that we also have in the library that I introduced on the first day. And they actually have some excerpts, so you don't need to, get a whole book, but you can read excerpts if you're really interested. And I think, for example, fascism is really interesting to read about, just to understand what people actually thought. So this is the quote from Mussolini and Gentile, and I'm going to read it out. Fascism is an historical conception in which man is what he is only insofar as he works with the spiritual process in which he finds himself, in the family or social group, in the nation, and in the history in which all nations collaborate. From this follows the great value of tradition in memories, in language, in customs, in the standards of social life. Interesting. Do you find anything we said earlier about fascism reflected in this quote? The nation, yeah. Mm-hmm. Good, yeah.
Spiritual process in which he finds himself is that focus on the collective rather than the individual.
Aha, very good, yes.
Keep referring back to idealized history.
Mm-hmm. Idealized history. Very good. I think at first sight it doesn't even, look that dangerous, this quote, And it's interesting to think about it. But what we definitely see reflected in here, I think, is, for example, the identity with tradition, memories, language, custom, standards of social life. That is quite interesting. The reference to the nation and the history, that is quite interesting. Or the spiritual process, and it tells us a little bit about what you said earlier about identity politics, right? Identifying with certain groups, with a certain nation, for example. Very good. Next one. That's actually the same text, Mussolini and Gentile, The Doctrine of Fascism. Against individualism, the fascist conception is for the state, and it is for the individual insofar as he coincides with the state, which is the conscience and universal will of man in his historical existence. It is opposed to classical liberalism, which arose from the necessity of reacting against absolutism, and which brought its historical purpose to an end when the state was transformed into the conscience and will of the people. Liberalism denied the state in the interests of the individual. Fascism reaffirms the state as the true reality of the individual. What do you think?
Ties into the real and felt needs.
Aha! Yes, very good. Ties in with the real and felt needs and the discrepancy between real and felt needs. Very good.
It's for the individual only in the agrees with the state.
Yes, the state is very much put, to the forefront. The state is really important, and there's lots of criticism regarding liberalism in here, right? So liberalism denied the state in the interest of the individual, but fascism reaffirms the state. Really important. Fascism reaffirms the state, and the state as the true reality of the individual. Anything else you find in this one?
Is it not like, I feel fascism makes the state one person, and then it's kind of making that one person that's otherwise more than what he is, like the idea of creating someone, having someone as in the state who is more than a man. So he was kind of like an untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that not what fascism does? It kind of makes this like higher up, kind of like almost like a different power altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And it's it's definitely opposed to all forms of pluralism. So there's usually only one party accepted in the political system. And I think Hitler, I mean, it wasn't only one person, it's just the most well-known person, but definitely there was only room for one type of thinking and one political party. So in this way, you're absolutely right. There's not really room for plurality, for different values, for different interests, for being creative. And in this way, it's very much opposed to liberalism. And this is why, in this one, liberalism is being attacked. And the other thing that is in this quote as well is that it's so related to historical developments, historical processes, right? So here it says liberalism, I don't have a screen again. So liberalism arose from the necessity of reacting against absolutism. So that was very important. And remember, when we thought about liberalism, we always thought, liberalism actually emerged in a time of feudalism, when there were social hierarchies and people decided, no, we need more equality. And this is actually acknowledged here by Mussolini and Gentile, and they say, but now, is the time to react again against liberalism and against this equality for a strong state. Okay, since the screen here is not working, I will just show you the next one. And this is actually from Hitler, Mein Kampf. So, of course, you have to read this all critically. So what do you think of this one?
It's interesting that he's characterised the weakness that he's reacting against as female. That I think is very characteristic of fashion, because again, every group would say you're weaker than the other group, in this case males.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. There's a feminist up there. So I mean, from a gender perspective, this is very relevant. Everything that is characterized as weak, he characterizes as female, right? So that's really relevant. Actually, also what he characterizes as pacifist is also female. Anything else that you find interesting? Yes, definitely. This is very racialist, right? Talking about the master people, so people better than others. This is definitely racialist. Very good. Yep.
It seems to kind of something like getting peace, well, people not really, by basically kind of conflict, I think, maybe going to facades. If somebody they try to say that not to gain peace, they have to kind of, go to war. No sense.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anything else you would like to mention? Yep.
A higher culture that is just a higher form of state, absolute power of the state.
Yes. Mm-hmm. A higher culture is also, I would say, yes, it's putting the state above other states, so it's ultra-nationalist as well. It's also racialist, I would say, if you say I have a higher culture than, let's say, you know, another nation or another people. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. There's another quote by Hitler that you can use in the PowerPoint presentation, but that's it for now. So please treat all of this very critically, of course. And yes, I see you all on Wednesday. Thank you very much for discussing. That was a really good interactive session. Thank you.